pronouns, she, her. I identify as a cisgender. I use either lesbian or queer, because even though I would say most accurately I just have a Kinsey 5 out of 6, which is like, if Nikolai would want to like touch my torso, I wouldn't say no. But like I have no interest in like, I don't actively desire men, I actively desire women. But I have in the past, my sexuality has been very fluid. So yeah, that's my short intro. For me, like queer, I'll talk more in depth about this later, but like I actually experienced this series as a very queer series, and that's like what I have, like I actually have lost a lot of interest in the series in the last few years, to be quite honest, sorry y'all, but like what I stay interested in, so I'm also a trauma-focused therapist, and I remain most interested in the kind of depictions of trauma and different states of, and the way that trauma impacts mental health and schemas of the world, and of characters' experiences of gender and sexuality. Yeah.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Lo, pronouns they, them. You can find me on Twitter at LoDeLanes, or on my WordPress, lodelangs.wordpress.com. I write about gender and sexuality and other related social structures. I identify as queer and genderqueer, so that definitely impacts how I read a lot of characters, especially when it comes to gender, and which ones I identify with, and maybe how I find some things in characters that I think cis readers might not. And I always enjoy talking about that and giving that perspective to people.
And hello, I am Sam, or Sam of the Rainbow Guard. I'm on Twitter as the Rainbow Guard. You may have seen me there. Hello, I'm so happy to be here. So my pronouns are he, they. I am a trans man. I am also queer, bisexual, in that pool. And I definitely think both of those things play a big part of the way I read A Song of Ice and Fire, and the way I kind of interact with the community at large. And it's been interesting to me too, just because I got into this series before I was out as trans. So this series has really been part of my journey, in coming to terms with my own gender identity and expression, as well as, falling in love with these characters and kind of, navigating the world with and through them in some ways. So I'm so excited to talk about all of this with you guys.
Navigating the world with and through them. That is a perfect phrase, and I think what draws all of us these characters, no matter, for such a wide variety of reasons. Does anyone want to go first and talk maybe about more specifics of ways that your queer identity impacts how you read the book, how you experience the book, and interacting with others around you? Who volunteers to read?
I can go first.
I was going to say, I went first last time.
I think one of the reasons I think it's important
very strongly with Brienne personally in my journey, so you'll probably hear us going back and forth a little with that. But not just Brienne. I mean, I think there are so many characters in this series that have really, really resonated with me on a queer level. That just because George does such an incredible job of really, really getting into the psyche of these different characters and really taking a hard look at identity and what it means to define yourself and what it means to say this is who I am. That's something that so many of these characters are going through, and part of that is because they're so young, and so they're all coming of age and becoming the people that they are. But he really, really plays so much with gender and sexuality in ways that I find interesting and that are sometimes subtle and sometimes not. But as a queer person, and specifically as a trans person, I will say, part of my experience has had to do with a lot of like self-reflection and getting to know myself and understanding very clearly, having to form a sense of self, right? Because when you're trans, the person you're told you're supposed to be is not who you are fundamentally. And I think everyone experiences that on some level, but to have gender as such a profound piece of that. And so I think just the way George delves into that and into some of these darker feelings of kind of the objection that a lot of queer people experience throughout this journey of kind of coming to terms with themselves in a way that's really interesting. I don't know.
Should we explain objection?
Go ahead.
Because
yes.
We are being nerdy and know what that means because we've studied gender studies at university and are nerds.
We're big nerds.
So basically, the abject is the opposite of the subject. You could basically say, as humans, we are all subjects, but those of us who can't be like accepted into society are seen as abjects, as others, as freakish, as abnormal. And that process is a lot of what queer people go through. And I've talked about that in relationship to Brienne on the Girls Gone Canon podcast, for instance. If anyone want to check that out, highly recommend. I cried. So there's also that.
Yeah, and I see this with queer characters within the story, or characters that I personally read as queer at least. But Brienne for sure. I see it with Renly for sure, which is not something that you hear a lot. But I also see it with characters that I don't necessarily read as, either queer or trans per se. I still see a lot of resonance with certain characters. And one of those is Theon Greyjoy. I do read him as cis and heterosexual generally. But there is so much within his story that really resonates with me and the way I have kind of experienced gender through the world, just in terms of the way he is broken down by the time we get to A Dance of Dragon. And, and Lo has written extensively about a lot of these kind of issues. But Theon specifically, one of the things we were talking about earlier is, just the first time I read, you have to remember your name. I had to put the book down and cry for a little while because that just hit so hard with my own feelings. And contextually, totally different, right? Obviously, I've never been, tortured and abused by Ramsay Snow. Thankfully, definitely want to keep it that way. But there's something about about Theon's journey and the way that George kind of explores some of these issues throughout that. It really, really hits home for me.
And I think even before Dance, so I noticed a lot of my people I was friendly with were Theon stans, and most of them happen to be trans. I was thinking about this more deeply and talking about it, and it's even before Dance, Theon is a character who exists on the margins in so many ways. And so I definitely think Theon is quite aggressively heterosexual, and even not counting the potential castration,
case this came up, so this is beautiful. And Lo is going to laugh at me for this.
Oh my
so
God.
this is Susan Stryker, who is one of the founders of trans studies as an academic discipline. But in one of her essays, she wrote this, and this really kind of sticks to me with what I'm most interested in exploring through A Song of Ice and Fire. So she writes, I call upon you, and so she is writing, as a trans woman, basically to a cisgender audience. This is her challenge, basically. She says, I call upon you to investigate your nature as I have been compelled to confront mine. I challenge you to risk objection and flourish as well as I have. Heed my words, and you may well discover the seams and sutures in yourself. And if that's not just A Song of Ice and Fire, I mean, that is exactly what George does. He breaks down these characters, so we are seeing the ways they have to suture themselves back together to become the people that they are.
Yeah, there's so many going through identity changes. Yeah. I guess if we're going this way, I'll do my little spiel. So Theon is very connected to water, so I will segue that into, I feel like for me, my queerness has impacted so much about how I read the books, and unfortunately how I interact with peers around it. I'm like, I'm only talking to queer people about this series ever again. Bye. But Brynden, Tully, and Cersei are characters that I connect with on a level that I would not I connect with very differently than I would if I were straight. So with Brynden Tully, I'm gonna get emotional. Also, I haven't really slept much, so I'm rambling. So Brynden Tully, I think, like a lot of people, I'll go back and see old forums where they're like, he just doesn't want to get married, and I'm like, share your Edmure point. This is a good counterpoint.
Yeah, so we were kind of going back and forth a little bit about just the dynamic between Hoster and the Blackfish, and is that like an inherent? Does that really say that the Blackfish is queer because he, had this conflict with his brother and refused to marry and all of these different things? And one of the things when I think about that whole relationship, one of the things that always kind of stands out to me is, Brynden is about 28, it sounds like, when he has the big argument with the Blackfish, when he gets the name the Blackfish. And it's a problem that he's not married. Edmure Tully is older than that and unmarried, and Hoster's heir, and, the house is in a somewhat precarious situation, and that does not seem to have been an issue for Hoster necessarily. I mean, we don't see any textual evidence that that's a problem for him when it comes to Edmure.
Because he knows that Edmure is attracted to women.
Because, yeah, I mean, we get that from Thomas Seven Strings, right? Like, we know that Edmure's at least trying to sleep with women, I guess. Yeah, so who knows?
But that is to say that I think that people have also read him as asexual, which I think is totally valid. I think that no matter who you are, if you see your identity reflected in a character, run with it, do it. Cersei, her attraction to Hyena is like, it really feels that way. And I think when you've gone through that experience, you can see it and not just be like, well, it's only about her trauma, it's only her wanting to be Robert. And we won't even go into the gender stuff with Cersei. Lo and I actually co-wrote an essay. Go in your notes app and write down a reminder to Google something called A Most Uncommon Woman, Cersei Lannister's Gender Trouble. We spent a few months writing it, and it's about her complex relationship with gender, and it's also, I think, Lo's pinned tweet.
Yeah.
So just go and read that, because we have many thoughts on Cersei and gender. That is a whole other dissertation.
LoTheLinks.wordpress.com.
Yes, LoTheLinks.wordpress.com.
Just make your favorite that, honestly. You'll do yourself a favor. So.
Great idea. All of them. Limited open tab.
Like I was saying earlier, as being a young bisexual woman, I was also raised in a Christian household. I was raised in a very traditional Christian household. So, growing up, if you're a woman, you're attracted to a man. If you're a man, you're attracted to a woman. There's nothing else. If you do, you're going to hell. I did not admit to myself until I was out of high school. I was 19 years old, and I was like, I'm not straight. And going back and reading, like, some of my favorite books from when I was younger, and seeing it from seeing like what characters are my favorite characters and what storylines I loved the most, I never realized how much it came back and reflected on myself. One of my favorite quotes of all time is a book called The Bermuda's Triangle, and it's about a young girl who finds out her two best friends are lesbians, and they got together during the summer that she was away at camp.
It's like that meme from Orange is the New Black. Like, they lesbianing together or whatever.
And like the quote always stuck with me, and I always loved the book. But part of me would never let myself also realize the reason why I loved this book was because I knew that these two girls were able to figure out about themselves, that they were in love, and they were able to be with themselves, and they were able to be together. Reading A Song of Ice and Fire, there's so much queer representation. Dorne as a whole fucking nation is just gay as fuck, and I love them for it. Seeing Pedro Pascal as Oberyn Martell in HBO was just
Watershed.
Yes, thank you.
It was.
He is like, I know, like I said earlier, like I hate like the bisexual stereotype that you're just out there to fuck everybody, but like it works for him. It works for Oberyn Martell. It works. He has this
Because we'd all fuck him.
Exactly. It works for him because even at the end of the day, he still goes home to this woman in his life, Ilaria. He still has that like number one person in his life that he will love and be with, and he wants to be with her literally until the end of his life. And that's something I loved. I loved being able to read that. That even if this person is still going out and doing whoever the fuck he wants, he still is able to find that partner in his life, and that the person that he wants to have his children with. I don't want that, but good for him. The children, the mother of his children, who helps raise them and helps raise, well, not raise his older girls, but I mean, you know, they look to her as a mother type figure, even if she didn't give birth to them. So I really loved everything from the Dorne plot lines in the books. Specifically in the books. Never talked about the show. Dorne was never in the show.
There's one in the show. I didn't.
No, there's never any Dorne in the show, other than Oberyn.
Yeah.
Except for Pedro Pascal.
Except for Pedro Pascal! So it's really interesting. I really love reading these books, and I really love something, Sam, I think earlier that resonated with me that you were saying about reading characters as trans and like them changing themselves to be who they want. I kind of think about like the faceless men. They're able to change to whoever they want, whatever they like, whatever bodies, faces, genders, anything. And part of me is like, well, how many faceless men decided to become faceless men, not just because they're like, this dude pissed me off, let's just go ahead and kill him.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Is that because they can take that and they can use it on themselves, and they're able to use, well, for lack of a better term, the magic from the faceless men to put themselves as whatever body type or whatever that they want to be.
It's like with how the Citadel and Night's Watch kind of exists for like these. If you're gay, if a man who you want to get married, you can go do those things. This is a good counterpoint. Never thought about that.
As I said, it was literally, I was just listening and I'm like, oh, this is that. Yes, thank you.
That also reminds me of, like, I think like half my brand is Brienne and half my brand is Alaris. And so, like, speaking of like going to an institution to be someone else, that's something I always used to want to remind people of the possibility of with Alaris / Sorella. Like, that's a thing. That's a thing. Alaris is a Ramazan. Because people often assume that they went to the Citadel for some like nefarious purpose or plotting purpose or whatever. And I just always want to say that maybe they like passing as a man and living as a man. Maybe it's both. And I think their story really connects to a lot of historical people who have done that, who have, like, people who have been assigned female at birth, who have gone into the military or into a monastery and then lived as men. And for a long time, historians have just said, oh, that's just women who want to get out of the like restrictive gender norms. Maybe. Or maybe they do identify as another gender and they like living their life like that. And I mean, that's a possibility. You can reinvent yourself and go to Citadel. I mean, that's what brave Danny Flint tried to do, and then they face the consequences of being a gender non-conforming person in this world, which is enforced heterosexuality to force you back into your place, which is also what Brienne is threatened with all the freaking time, because they are better at being a man than a lot of men they meet, and people are like, no, that's fucked up. We want to use sexual violence to put you back into your womanly place. And that's reflected in our work. If you look at hate crimes towards trans people and gender non-conforming people, that's it. That's what happens.
Yeah, I can't think about or look at the sections that talk about brave Danny Flint without looking at Brandon Tina.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It just feels like such a direct kind of parallel, especially just with the timing of, you know, when the books were published and things like that. You know, the books were being written, you know, not long after the actual crime itself, but then also, you know, when the Boys Don't Cry movie kind of, again, brought it all back to the kind of cultural forefront. I think that was probably on George's mind. I mean, that feels like a kind of direct inspiration for that particular moment, and that's something that, yeah, I go back to a lot. And I think that's so interesting about, you know, within Westeros, these institutions where there is this possibility of escape from some of these norms in terms of, if you are a gay man, the Night's Watch sounds like a pretty good place for you, you know, or the Citadel, you know what I mean? I mean, genuinely, like, that's an option for you where you're not, you know, having to go and marry and you know, do the whole heterosexual script that you're given as a Westerosi man, right? But on the flip side of that, you know, there is that potential for violence if you're seen as stepping too far outside of that.
Yeah, I think what's important to hold is that in any text, no matter, in the world, period, no matter if you read somebody as trans, as cis, as straight, as gay, as whatever, everybody is impacted by heterosexism and sexism, and
beautiful lines that have been men talking about the men that they love in their life.
Yeah.
John Connington talking about how I reached for the star over. Oh God, I reached.
Rose too high,
I rose too
love
high, I
too
reached
hard,
high.
dare too much.
And
I
fell.
tried to grasp the
I
star,
mean, like, he
overreached.
has to be extra. We know, like we
Yes.
gays do. You know?
Yes. And it is, even though I can't talk today and I can't remember things off the top of my head, it is one of my favorite quotes of all time that George has written. And he writes such a beautiful, like, I want to call it prose.
Yeah.
Prose when he's talking about love. Especially when, like Loris. The way he wrote Loris talking about Renly. When a candle goes out and no other one can
Even the sun cannot reflect.
Yes.
I can't talk today, I'm giving up, I'm sorry.
We're like,
And like it's quotes like that that really stick with you, and you can tell that even if people want to be deliberately just head in the sand, don't want to talk about it, George knows, and George is more than willing to write those characters, and he would probably love to hear like, oh well, I think this character is gay, or I think this character is asexual, just to see like, oh, that's how I'm writing to this community. This is how it feels to this community. This is how it's feeling to this community.
if he listens to us about that, can he listen to us about Linda next? Like, I don't know. Anyway, yeah, John Con, I adore.
From your lips to Guernsey.
Yeah, but I adore John Con. He really, I get a But anyways, I was like, use the shows that you're cishet because we do not have content. We have to have characters meet who have never met each other in order to have any fucking content. So like, that is the experience of like queerness and fan fiction and how they intersect.
Thinking about fan fiction, when you were speaking earlier about Alaris, I read a lovely fanfic that had Alaris and Oberon was the main character, and he was talking about how Alaris is his son, and it talked a lot. I know, it broke my heart.
Send the link.
It was beautiful. I really loved it, and it talked a lot about originally Sorilla deciding to go to Old Town, and because they wanted to go and they wanted to learn, and that was the only way they were going to be able to learn like their father did, and that was why they started, was they wanted to try and forge their own Maester's Links chain. I am done. My brain is dead. And while they're there, they went through this journey as themselves, being able to live as themselves as Alaris, and it talks about him coming home and like just talking with Oberon and talking with Ilaria. It was an AU. Oberon lived. I was in my dumb bitch juice. And talking with Oberon and talking with Ilaria about this basically transformation of themselves, about living as themselves, and it was beautiful. And if we don't get this in fan fiction, we're not going to get it. There's a lot of hate for fan fiction. There's a lot of like, oh, it's badly written. Oh, it's horrible people. It's horrible characters. I'm like, you're just not finding the right fan fiction. You just need to dig.
And you know, just to kind of jump on this, I think fan fiction can be really healing too in a lot of ways. You know, so I'm not a person who is like published any A Song of Ice and Fire fan fiction, but when I was in my early 20s and not able to deal at all with the fact that I was trans, I was sitting in my notes app just constantly typing out Brienne of Tarth trans fan fiction. And like, I couldn't process it for me, but I could process it for them. And that was a way for me to just kind of work through the thoughts that I couldn't handle at that moment myself. You know what I mean? So I think it can be just really amazing. You know what I mean?
It's healing. It's deeper.
You're giving yourself your own therapy.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's cheaper. It's certainly cheaper.
Then you can become one.
It's always easier
I did it. If I did it, anyone can.
somebody's character.
Yeah.
How much time do we have left?
It is not. Oh, we have 9 minutes.
We can take audience questions and comments, and I also want to add too, if we don't get to you, feel free to talk to us about gay shit after this. You'll see us around.
Add me on Twitter. Add me on Twitter. I'm always up for that gay shit.
Yeah, feel free to approach us if we don't get to you. Yeah, Sarah.
So the thing that, as a straight woman, obviously, I see things differently, obviously.
Yeah.
And then I was just thinking when you were talking about, you see, Santa, she's gonna have to be, married. That's married to a man, that kind of thing. Then you go the opposite of Arya, who is basically being forced in this way. As queer people, how do you feel Arya? How do you see Arya's journey?
We all have
We all just took a big breath.
Okay, real quick, before we touch on Arya, I did the War of the Roses panel earlier with Aziz, and I wasn't able to touch on this. If we go the same route as the show, and I'm God hoping we get Sansa as Queen of the North, I very much believe that she will be like Queen Elizabeth I.
Yeah.
She will not marry, she will not have a king, she will sit the throne by her goddamn self.
Hell yeah!
Hell yeah!
but she will get lots of lovers.
Yes, she fucking will.
And maybe like somebody can carry on the Stargate, but it doesn't all actually have to come from her if she doesn't want it to.
Exactly.
You know? If she wants it to, cool.
But yeah, sorry. I just wanted to touch on that real fast. I was like, wait, no, hold on. I have a thing. But yes, we also have lots of feelings about Arya Stark.
Okay, so I once wrote an essay about Arya and Brienne, talking about gender nonconformity. And one thing I think is interesting with Arya is that her tomboyism is sort of accepted. And we were talking about Jack Halvorsen before, and one thing that Jack Halvorsen, a big gender theorist, has talked about is how tomboyism is accepted until you reach teenagehood, and then you're forced back on the straight and narrow. But
how the North versus the South raises their children.
And plus, Ned too also has the Liana advantage, right?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
he has lived with, having a sister who does not, conform to gender norms necessarily.
Which we didn't even touch on any of that.
I know. I think there's a whole panel that could easily be done about queer Arya Stark stuff.
I was going to say we have about 5 minutes. We have one question right here.
So I wanted to touch on Daenerys.
Yes.
In her early story, she's obviously promised to Viserys when they come of age, but she doesn't seem to actually be attracted to him. Whereas obviously there was attraction with other Targaryen brother sister couplings, and then Jaime and Cersei. And then she's pushed off to Khal Drogo. Eventually does have desire for him. Then has male lovers after him, and then suddenly is what I thought was surprising was obviously with one or more of her handmaids. But I was wondering if you guys thought that maybe was kind of always there with her, or if part of it was less so to do with genuine desire and more so to do with I'm horny and also I'm kind of assumed the role that a man traditionally would have, I'm a leader and I get these perks of having people who work for me pleasure me.
Yeah, the latter. Sort of. But yeah, it's not. Well, what's interesting is that in the Daenerys scene, she actually, I think, she's one being fingered or even out, whichever one. She's the recipient, and I think that, and she's picturing her handmaiden as what's his name, Dario. And so I think that, personally, I do not read her. I think that if you are queer and you read her as queer, that's fine. As I said, I think anyone can read any character however the hell they want, and if it makes you feel empowered and more felt and more if you feel about Daenerys' experience the way I feel about Cersei's, then great. I'm glad you feel reflected. I feel like that particular scene is very much George not understanding, and you talked about how with Jon Con and Renly and Loras they get these lovely romantic lines, and with women together it's only ever kind of crass, and they're only ever picturing either themselves as men or their partner as a man, because he just cannot conceptualize you can be attracted to a woman. But so I do think I don't really read it as genuine desire with Daenerys personally, because of the way that she's so removing versus with Cersei and Taena, she's actively desiring Taena throughout the book, and then it culminates in that scene. But I think that if you want to read Daenerys as bisexual, go ahead. If that's your experience, if you're resonates with your experience, then great.
One thing I wanted to bring up is some of that reads to me as reading as a bisexual woman. There's a lot of if you have a relationship with a man, that's a real relationship. But if you have a relationship with women, it's not a real thing. It's not as strong as your relationship with a man. And you get that a lot trying to date. I get it a lot trying to date and talking about potential partners with anybody. And thinking about this scene with Dany and her handmaiden, it kind of feels like that. It's oh yeah, she's with a woman, but because it's a woman, it's not a real thing. It's not an actual relationship. It's not something that she should be actively seeking.
And in the Cersei scene, George writes in the line, "But it was no good."
Exactly.
When it's I think that when you said George is more than happy to write queerness, I think he does it accidentally most of the time. He does it despite himself, and that's why I think makes the depictions of queerness so powerful, because queerness happens despite our best attempts. No one I don't think any of us come out of the womb who are yes, I would love to be marginalized. It'd be great. It just happens, and it's messy and chaotic, and in the way that it happens in books.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I like what you're saying, just because I feel like sometimes George writes queer women and queer men so differently, or same-sex encounters between women so very differently than he writes queer men. You know what I mean? Especially the Daenerys scene, in my opinion, because he is so lyrical about the way he describes this tragic love between these different men, pairs of men we see, right? Right. Whereas when it's women, it's yeah. I think it's interesting.
I wonder if that's a reflection of the times. He's so good at reflecting a lot of the zeitgeist, maybe on the Iraq War and the dragon, whatever. Sure.
all so much for coming out. It's been lovely to be gay with you all.
Yeah. If you say your question or comment, feel free to find us and talk about it later.
Yes.
We're so excited to talk
We are
about
always
this.
here for that gay